Your Obsidian reach extends beyond the physical world, touching the lives of others through the power of your shared digital stories. Join us as we celebrate the connections that make us human in an artificial world. Click subscribe now and expand your own cinematic reach with our community.
I didn't say a word when it happened. Not when my manager stood up in front of the whole department and announced it. Not when 37 people in that Zoom call went quiet all at once. That specific kind of quiet where you can almost hear people deciding whether to feel bad for you or just relieved it wasn't them. Not even when HR unmuted herself and said my name again, slower this time, like I hadn't heard it the first time. I just sat there, stared at the camera, and thought, they have no idea what they just did. Let me back up. I had worked at Holloway & Crane Compliance Solutions for 11 years. 11 years of quarterly audits, federal reporting cycles, client-side inspections, and enough regulatory paperwork to wallpaper a football stadium. I started as a junior compliance analyst fresh out of college, worked my way up to Senior Federal Audit Coordinator, and somewhere along the way became the person the entire company depended on for one very specific, very critical function. I was the only person at Holloway & Crane who held an active federal inspection credential under the EPA's Tier II site assessment program. To be clear about what that means, our company had contracts with 14 industrial clients across 3 states. Each of those clients was required by federal law to pass a certified site inspection every 18 months. Holloway & Crane had won those contracts specifically because we had a credentialed inspector on staff. That inspector was me. My name, my license number, my signature on every single report. For years, I had flagged this to my supervisors. I had written it in annual reviews, brought it up in department meetings, emailed it to the compliance director with subject lines like succession planning urgent and what happens if I win the lottery. I was half joking, but only half. The answer was always some version of, we'll get to it. We're stretched thin right now. Put together a proposal and we'll revisit in Q3. Q3 would come. Nothing. Q3 would come again. Nothing. After about the 4th year of this, I stopped being surprised and started being strategic. I documented every conversation. I kept copies of every email. I maintained meticulous records, not because I was planning anything, but because I had worked in compliance long enough to know that the only thing standing between you and disaster is documentation. That habit saved me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Her name was Tiffany, and she had been with the company for 14 months. She had come in as a departmental operations coordinator, a title that, as far as I could tell, meant she scheduled meetings, forwarded emails, and reminded people about deadlines they were already aware of. She was sharp, I'll give her that. She was organized, she was fast, and she had a talent for making herself seem indispensable to people who didn't look too closely at what she was actually doing. More importantly, she was extremely close with the regional director. Not professionally close, personally close. They had gone to the same university. Their families were apparently friends. I don't know the specifics, and I never asked, because in 11 years of corporate life I had learned that asking about that kind of thing never ends well for the person asking. What I did notice was that over those 14 months, Tiffany had accumulated a level of access and influence that was unusual for someone 2 years out of college. She had been added to meetings she had no reason to be in. She had started weighing in on decisions that were technically outside her role. And about 6 months before everything fell apart, she had been given the unofficial title of Operations Strategy Lead, which as far as anyone could tell meant she now had authority over how the department submitted expense reports. That's where it started. In February, I flew to a client site in Baton Rouge for a Tier II inspection. 3 days, 2 nights mandatory in person because federal site assessments cannot be done remotely. That's not a preference, that's law. I booked a mid-range hotel, a rental car, 2 checked bags because I was carrying inspection equipment, and my meals for 3 days. I submitted everything to the expense system with receipts attached, same as I had done dozens of times before. The reimbursement came back short, not by a little, by $847. I sent a follow-up. Got a response from Tiffany's assistant explaining that some of my expenses had been flagged as excessive under the new travel policy, a policy I had not seen, had not been trained on, and had not been notified about before the trip. I replied asking for the policy document. Got a 2-line response referencing a section of the employee handbook that had apparently been updated 3 weeks before my trip. The section that now capped hotel accommodations at $89 per night for domestic travel. $89 a night. In Baton Rouge, in February, during a regional trade conference that had pushed hotel rates in the entire downtown corridor to north of $200. I wrote back explaining this. I included a screenshot of the conference hotel rate calendar and noted that the federal contract under which I was traveling had its own reimbursement guidelines that superseded internal policy for work conducted under government-adjacent agreements. Tiffany responded herself this time. She said my receipts had been reviewed and the determination was final. She said if I felt the policy was unclear, I was welcome to submit feedback through the HR portal. She said she hoped I understood that the new travel guidelines were being applied consistently across all staff. And then she signed the email, Tiffany, Operations Strategy Lead. I printed that email. I put it in a folder. I labeled the folder with the date and went back to work. Over the next 3 months, I noticed other things. Tiffany had started sitting in on the client coordination calls I ran, the ones where we discussed inspection schedules and federal reporting deadlines. She wasn't a participant technically. She was listed as an observer. But she started asking questions, and not general questions, specific ones, about timelines, about which clients were due for inspection, about what happened if an inspection was delayed. I answered them professionally because that's what you do. But I noted them. I noted everything. Then in April, 2 things happened in the same week. The first, I submitted a reimbursement for a mandatory recertification course I was required to complete to maintain my federal inspector credential. The course was $1,200, required every 3 years, explicitly listed in my employment contract as a company-covered expense. It came back denied. Tiffany's signature on the denial. Reason given, professional development expenses require pre-approval under new policy. The second, I got a LinkedIn message from a former colleague who now worked at a competing firm. She said she'd heard through the grapevine that Holloway & Crane was looking to outsource some of their federal compliance work. She wasn't sure of the details, but she thought I should know. I sat with that for a while. Then I went home that evening, opened my laptop, and started getting organized. I pulled every email, every approval trail, every inspection report, every federal submission that had my credential number on it. I exported them to an encrypted external drive. I documented the chain of custody for every active inspection file. I made a list, a careful, detailed list of every federal deadline that was coming up in the next 6 months and exactly what would happen if those deadlines were missed. I wasn't planning to do anything with any of it. I just wanted it to exist somewhere outside of company servers, because I had worked in compliance for 11 years and I knew what it looked like when a company started preparing to make someone disappear. 3 weeks later, they made me disappear. It was a Tuesday, 9 in the morning. I got a calendar invite at 8:47 for a 900 meeting, which is never a good sign. The invite included HR and the regional director. The title was Check-in, Operations Alignment. I knew before I clicked join. There were 5 people on the call: HR, the regional director, the director of legal, Tiffany, and me. Nobody made small talk. HR went through it quickly. My position was being eliminated due to a restructuring of the compliance function. My last day was effective immediately. I would receive 2 weeks of severance. My access would be revoked upon ending the call. Tiffany did not speak during this call. She just sat in the corner of the grid, camera on, expression neutral. Watching. The regional director thanked me for my contributions. He said the word contributions like he was reading it off a cue card. I said, I understand. Can I confirm, is my federal inspection credential being transferred to another staff member, or is the company engaging an external credentialed inspector? Silence. The regional director said they were working on the transition plan. I said, okay, I just want to make sure you're aware that 4 of our current client inspection cycles are scheduled within the next 60 days, and 2 of those are under active federal monitoring periods. If those inspections don't happen on schedule, the clients will be in violation of their Tier II reporting requirements. More silence. HR said they appreciated the heads up and would make sure the information was passed along. I said, great, thank you for the opportunity. I hope the transition goes smoothly. And then I left the call. They revoked my system access within about 4 minutes of the call ending. Email, internal drive, the client management portal, all of it, gone. Fast and thorough. What they did not do was ask for my personal laptop back. I had been approved to work from home 2 days a week for the past 3 years. I had a company-issued laptop for that, yes, but I also had my personal device, which I had used for remote access through the company VPN. And on that personal device, cached in a folder I had created during my documentation session 3 weeks prior, were 11 years of carefully maintained compliance records. They also did not immediately disable my work email. I don't know if that was an oversight or if they were planning to keep it active for a few days for forwarding purposes. I didn't ask. But for approximately 6 hours after my termination, my work email was still live. I used 4 of those hours. I didn't do anything dramatic. I didn't email clients. I didn't email the board. I didn't send anything to anyone that I wasn't supposed to send. What I did was forward one email to my personal address. It was an email I had sent 14 months ago to the compliance director with the subject line, Federal Inspection Credential Succession Risk Action Required. It laid out in clear and professional language that I was the sole credentialed inspector at the company, that no succession plan existed, that 4 federal contracts were dependent on my continued active credential, and that in the event of my departure without adequate transition time, the company would be unable to fulfill its regulatory obligations to those clients. The compliance director at the time had replied with 2 sentences. Thanks for flagging. We'll discuss in the next quarterly planning cycle. That was the email. That was it. I forwarded it to myself, closed the laptop, and went to make coffee. At 3:14 that afternoon, my phone rang. It was a number I recognized, a federal government area code, a specific extension I had spoken to before. The EPA Regional Compliance Office. The inspector on the line was a woman I had worked with professionally on several joint review projects. She was businesslike, not unkind. She said she had received an automated flag from the federal credentialing system indicating that my license status had been updated to inactive employer separation. She said this had triggered an automated review of any pending inspections linked to my credential. She said, "We're showing 2 clients with active monitoring periods whose next mandatory inspections are scheduled in the next 45 days. Both are linked solely to your credential. Can you confirm whether Holloway and Crane has arranged for a credentialed replacement to cover these inspections?" I said, "I was notified of my termination this morning. I don't have any information about their transition plan." She said, "Okay, I'm going to need to reach out to them directly. This is a time-sensitive compliance matter." I said, "I completely understand. I do want to mention for the record that I flagged this exact risk scenario to company leadership 14 months ago in writing. I have the documentation if it becomes relevant to any review process." She paused. Then she said, "I'd appreciate it if you held on to that." I said, "Already done." The call ended. I sat in my kitchen for a moment and thought about the word contributions. I found out what happened next from 2 sources, a former colleague who was still inside, and the public federal compliance database, which logs enforcement actions and inspection status for Tier II sites. At approximately 4:30 that same afternoon, 7.5 hours after my termination, the EPA regional office contacted Holloway and Crane's legal department. They wanted written confirmation that active inspection obligations would be fulfilled within the regulatory window and documentation of who the credentialed replacement inspector would be. The legal team apparently had no idea what they were being asked, because nobody had told them. The termination decision had been made by the regional director and executed by HR, and legal had been on the 9 a.m. call in a rubber-stamped capacity. Nobody had thought to actually ask them whether eliminating the sole credentialed inspector mid-inspection cycle was something they should review first. When legal dug into it, they found out very quickly there was no credentialed replacement. There was no external inspector on contract. The transition plan the regional director had mentioned on my termination call existed in the same way that New Year's resolutions exist, as an intention that had never been written down or acted on. The federal inspector's call had logged the inquiry formally. That meant the clock was now running. The clients had to be notified. 2 of them, a chemical distribution facility and an agricultural processing plant, were in active monitoring periods, meaning any inspection delay would trigger automatic reporting obligations to state environmental agencies, which would trigger their own review timelines, which would generate fines. The clients found out before end of business that day. My former colleague told me that by Wednesday morning, she could hear the regional director's voice through 2 closed doors. That Tiffany had not come into the office, that the director of legal had flown in from the regional headquarters overnight. The compliance director, a different one than the one who had responded to my email 14 months ago. That person had left the company, apparently pulled up the credential succession file and found my warning email. The one I had forwarded to myself. The one with the 2-sentence response. My former colleague said the phrase used in an emergency leadership meeting was, "She told us exactly this would happen." I was not in that meeting. I did not hear that phrase spoken. But I believe it. On Thursday, 2 days after my termination, I received a call from the director of legal himself. He was professional. He was calm. He was doing a very good job of sounding like this was a routine call. He asked if I would be willing to have a conversation about a consulting arrangement. Temporary, he said, just to help manage the transition on the active inspection cycles. He mentioned that the company would be prepared to compensate me at a rate commensurate with the urgency of the situation. I said, "I appreciate you reaching out. Before we discuss terms, I want to make sure we're on the same page about a few things." He said, "Of course." I said, "I was terminated without cause, effective immediately, with 2 weeks of severance. I have documentation showing I flagged the exact risk this creates 14 months ago with no action taken. I want to understand whether the company is in a position to acknowledge that my termination created a compliance crisis before we talk about whether I'm the right person to help resolve it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think that's a fair framing." We had 2 more calls after that. By the end of the week, I had signed a short-term consulting agreement at a day rate that was significantly higher than what my full-time salary had worked out to per day. I also had a written acknowledgement, carefully worded, drafted by their legal team, reviewed by a lawyer I hired for exactly this purpose, that my termination had been made without consideration of active federal obligations and that the company was accepting responsibility for ensuring continuity of those obligations going forward. They did not admit wrongdoing explicitly. Lawyers rarely let that happen, but the acknowledgement existed. I kept a copy. I completed the 2 active inspections that were in the critical window. I did my job, same as I always had, because the clients hadn't done anything wrong and the regulatory consequences would have fallen on them too. Tiffany left the company approximately 6 weeks after my termination. I don't know if she was asked to leave or if she saw the writing on the wall. I don't know what she took away from any of it. I hope it was something. The regional director stepped down from his role 4 months later. The company announced it as a voluntary transition. I have no inside information about what that means. I read the press release like everyone else. What I know is this. I have since moved on to a position at a firm that, in my first week, had me document my credential, identify a backup candidate, and set a 12-month certification plan for a second staff member. When I mentioned I had sent exactly this kind of recommendation to a previous employer for 4 years without response, my new director looked genuinely confused. She said, "Why wouldn't you just do that?" "It's basic risk management." I said, "That's a really good question. I think about Tiffany sometimes. Not with anger, not anymore. I think about what it must feel like to make a decision that confident, that fast, about someone you've worked alongside for a year and change, and to be so certain you've got the full picture that you don't even think to ask, what does this person actually do? Not what's in their job title, not what they submit receipts for, what they do, what depends on them, what disappears when they're gone." She never asked that question. And that $847 she held back, the reimbursement that started all of this, I never did get that back officially. But the day rate I charged for those 2 emergency inspections covered it about 43 times over, so I call it even. If there's anything I'd want someone to take from this, it's not document everything, though yes, document everything, always. It's not know your worth, though that too. It's this, the work you do quietly, the expertise you've built slowly, the institutional knowledge that lives only in your head, that has weight, real weight. The kind that doesn't show up on an org chart and doesn't get appreciated until the moment it's absent. They didn't know what they had until they let it walk out the door. Most people never find out the hard way. I got lucky. Unlucky enough to get fired. Lucky enough to watch them discover the answer in real time. I didn't need to say a word. The federal compliance system said it for me. I've had a lot of time to think about what actually happened. Not the sequence of events, I have that memorized, but the why underneath all of it. Tiffany didn't fire me because she was cruel. I don't think she thought about me much at all, honestly. That was the whole problem. She looked at a line item on a reimbursement report and saw a number she could reduce. She looked at a job title and saw a cost center she could restructure. She never once looked at the actual work, the 11 years of knowledge, the federal credential, the inspection cycles, the 4 clients who depended on a system that only one person in the building knew how to run. She saw the receipt. She never saw the infrastructure behind it. And that's what I keep coming back to when I think about what smart actually means in a professional context. Because Tiffany was smart. She was fast. She was organized. She knew how to work a room and read a political landscape. That kind of intelligence is real, and I'm not dismissing it. But there's another kind of intelligence, the slower, less visible kind, that comes from actually learning the work, from understanding the systems, not just the org chart, from asking, before you make a decision, what am I not seeing here? She never asked that question. And the regional director, who should have known better after years in that industry, didn't ask it either. They moved fast, and they moved confident, and they were wrong in a way that cost the company a great deal more than $847. What I did right wasn't some elaborate strategy. I didn't plan any of this. What I did was show up every day for 11 years and actually do the work. I documented things because I respected the work, not because I was building a case. I flagged a succession risk because I genuinely believed the company should have a plan, not because I was protecting myself. The paper trail existed because careful people create paper trails. It's just what you do when you take a job seriously. That's the part nobody talks about when they tell these kinds of stories. The revenge isn't really the point. The point is that doing your job with integrity, with thoroughness, with real attention, that accumulates. It becomes something solid, something that can't be quietly restructured away in a Tuesday morning Zoom call, even when someone tries. I didn't fight Tiffany. I didn't make a scene. I didn't send a dramatic email. I forwarded one document that I had written 14 months earlier in good faith, because a federal inspector had asked me a direct question and I gave her an honest answer. The consequences came from the work itself, from the reality of what I had been doing and what stopped happening the moment I was gone. That's the thing about integrity. It's not a strategy. It's not leverage. It's not a card you play. It's just what's left standing when everything else gets stripped away. Tiffany could take my access, my email, my badge, my salary. She couldn't take 11 years of knowing exactly what I knew. I hope she learned something. I genuinely do. Not because I'm a good person trying to be generous. I'm human. There was a part of me that was satisfied watching it unfold. But because the lesson was right there, so clear, and it cost a lot of people who had nothing to do with her decision to figure it out. Do the work. Learn the thing, not just the title. Ask what you don't know before you move. And document everything. Not out of paranoia, but out of respect for the truth. That's it. That's everything I've got.